Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you've had a stimulating coffee break and full of renewed energy for our panel, which is going to focus on traditional and non-traditional security. Those of you who are eagle-eyed will have maybe noticed that in the program, the description of this panel is identical to the one that preceded it, in which case you are the lucky owners of an exclusive, flawed copy of our conference proceedings. But as will soon become clear, the focus is not, in fact, EU-China relations, but more broadly the question of identifying the primary security challenges in the Indo-Pacific, asking the question how individual states, both from Europe and Asia, should prioritize those particular traditional security risks. That might include threats to territorial integrity, national sovereignty, and also the question that I'm sure we're going to want to look at quite closely, which is assessing the likelihood of military conflict in the immediate future. Some of those issues will, of course, involve bigger questions about how best to combat regional security threats, the consequences of the build-up of North Korea's security capabilities, the claims in the United States. 2027 is a pivotal year in terms of the vulnerability of Taiwan to some form of coercion from China, out of which, of course, these bigger questions of preparedness and nuclear proliferation emerge. But we would also want to discuss non-traditional security threats. And part of that, it also involves assessing the extent to which, again, the familiar subject of Trump 2.0 is changing the way we think about those security threats. Some of you may have noticed that Eldridge Colby, in his confirmation hearings in the United States Senate, made a number of public statements that seemed to raise eyebrows both in the US and in the region about America's commitment to its traditional security allies. Most perhaps dramatically of all, Colby's decision to describe Taiwan as a non-existential security threat from the point of view of the United States, raising really, I suppose, questions about how alliance politics is changing. And of course, as we've heard already, personnel changes in the United States, the gutting of the National Security Council, continuing questions about the longevity of Pete Hegseth at the Pentagon, given some of the internal chaos that is engulfing the defense community, and of course, local assessments about security vulnerabilities. It was striking that acting President Han Duck-soo, during his brief tenure as president, identified the increased probability that North Korea might be minded to engage in provocations. This was not simply an assertion comparable to that of his predecessor, President Yoon, who claimed that North Korea's aggression justified his declaration of martial law. But it did indicate, I think, a growing preoccupation about the willingness of Kim Jong-un to threaten the integrity of South Korea. All of which, of course, has fed into this wider discourse at the level of public opinion in South Korea about the importance of embracing South Korea's own independent nuclear deterrent. But there's much more to talk about, including non-traditional security challenges, pandemic mitigation, at a time when RFK Jr., the Secretary of Health, is questioning the reliability of peer-reviewed journals such as The Lancet and making extraordinary arguments about needing to change the rules governing the freedom of scientists to publish freely. All of these issues are, of course, bringing us back to this perennial question of the integrity of our open societies and at the extent to which they're at risk. And as we heard in previous panels, of course, domestic politics, the rise of populism, both in Europe and, of course, in Asia. We've heard a lot about Prime Minister Modi and the power of popular nationalism. If that weren't enough, of course, the more long-term non-traditional security challenges, including demographic pressures, and in a week or so in which Japanese politics and Japanese economic management has been thrown into some degree of uncertainty, given Prime Minister Ishiba's statements about Japan's debt level being equivalent to that of Greece, there are, I think, real concerns about the ability of states that have traditionally played a major role in preparing for some of these security threats to finance their provision. So we have a great panel to look at these issues. Again, just to briefly remind you who they are and the order they'll be speaking. Dr. Edward Howell from Oxford University, followed by Dr. Scott Moore of the University of Pennsylvania, Professor Haruko Sato from Osaka in Japan, and last but not least, Professor Kevin Gray at the University of Sussex. So, Edward, if you'd like to go first.
Thank you, John. Good afternoon. Just to quote from Hamlet, they say that brevity is the soul of wit. I can't promise to be amusing given the issues on which I'll be talking about, but I'll try and be brief. I think if there's one of many things that the Ukraine war is teaching us, it's that the Euro-Atlantic and the Indo-Pacific theatres are anything but separate. And actually, what we knew all along was confirmed at the end of April, when both Russia's Chief of the General Staff, Valery Gerasimov, and subsequently Kim Jong-un, admitted not just the presence of North Korean troops in the Kursk region, but, and I quote, the victorious conclusion of the liberation of the Kursk area. And on Wednesday of this week, Sergei Shoigu, the Secretary of Russia's Security Council, made clear how North Korea and Russia are, and I quote, together in one trench, not only defending our sovereignty and dignity, but also fighting to build a new multipolar world order. Such military comradeship is worth a lot. I'm going to focus on three security challenges to the broader East Asian region, and particularly the Korean Peninsula, at a time of domestic political change. And of course, this domestic political change is not limited to the Trump administration in the United States. Next week, it's likely that there will be a more left-leaning government in Seoul, although Lee Jae-myung, the likely president, would most likely grimace at my usage of the term, given how for the past few months he's made clear how the Democratic Party is a centrist conservative party. So the first challenge is North Korea, and it's significant in my view for three main reasons. The first is perhaps quite obvious, it's Pyongyang's heightened conventional and nuclear capabilities. Yes, the warship that capsized earlier last week was an embarrassing mishap for Kim Jong-un, but what North Korea's response to this entire accident actually shows is that Pyongyang has no intention of rowing back, if you pardon the pun, on its military modernization and its overall nuclear modernization. Right? This destroyer was not just any old warship, it was a missile-capable destroyer. North Korea's ultimate goal is to be recognized as a de facto nuclear-armed state, and Pyongyang's foreign policy has been premised around what I call strategic delinquency. Bad behavior pays. North Korean missile launches make clear how its capabilities are increasing in scope and sophistication. Yes, this is not rapid, but the missiles are flying higher, further, and staying airborne for longer. The second issue with North Korea is that the threat from North Korea is now multi-pronged. It's not just the vertical proliferation of nuclear weapons and delivery systems. This is now coupled with the heightened rapprochement between Cold War patron and client, namely Russia and the DPRK. And this is not just a cash for artillery exchange. We've now seen ballistic missiles and 14,000 troops in two separate deployments heading in Moscow's direction in exchange for food, cash, oil, but also, and crucially for Kim Jong-un, advanced missile and military technology. In November 2023, when North Korea launched a satellite successfully, 2 months after Kim met Putin at the Vostochny Cosmodrome in the Russian Far East, it was perhaps a little too early for any substantive Russian technology to have been used in this specific deployment. But actually, moving forward, this relationship, in my view, will outlast the Ukraine war, even though it will likely change. On the one hand, Kim Jong-un does not want to lose Russia. The question of whether any US-Russia rapprochement may pull Russia apart from the DPRK is no doubt one of many on his mind. But the Russia-North Korean strategic relationship, epitomized in the Comprehensive Strategic Partnership Treaty signed in June last year, made clear that the cooperation was not just in the military domain. If you go and read the treaty, I'd advise you to read Article 10, science and technology, AI, information technology, and biology. The third reason for the significance of North Korea, as I've mentioned and briefly alluded to, is the fact that relations between Pyongyang and Seoul and Pyongyang and Washington are at an all-time low. The likely president, Lee Jae-myung, may say that he wants to restore the inter-Korean hotline, but Pyongyang has severed communications. Is North Korea really going to pick up after Kim Jong-un's significant change to North Korea's policy toward the south, namely abandoning the reunification of the Korean Peninsula, which was announced in December 2023 and January 2024? The second challenge is the role of alliances and partnerships and the possibility of a dual contingency in the Indo-Pacific. Yes, we know the Trump administration's got a transactional approach to alliances, which contrasts that with the Biden administration. Whilst Biden was unable to deter the North Korean nuclear threat successfully, Biden prioritized assuring, reassuring, and constantly reassuring allies, the Camp David summit being one example here. The risk now is that perhaps the US-ROK alliance, whilst it's likely to remain, will start to weaken or diminish in importance for either side, particularly given Washington's foreign policy. Akin to how Kim Jong-un and Trump used Moon Jae-in as a means of getting through to the other side in 2018, Trump now views South Korea as a tool through which to get through to China. This is an issue because the trilateral cooperation between South Korea, the US, and Japan, witnessed in the Camp David summit, in the Washington Declaration as well, was a significant but small step in a long journey ahead. And when Kishida and Yoon met in Tokyo in 2023 for the first such summit in 12 years, even though no deal was signed, particularly with respect to the forced labour issue, this was no insignificant moment. Does Trump have any interest in ROK-Japan collaboration against an increasingly aggressive North Korea? We know that South Korea can try and preserve this relationship predominantly by increasing their financial contributions, particularly in terms of cost sharing. And if I just pause for a moment, this is a debate that has been roaming around the United Kingdom as well. If we are in a new Cold War, just look at the defence spending of countries during the Cold War. With respect to a dual contingency, I think there is a clear sentiment in South Korea that any Taiwan contingency is likely to involve some element of change with respect to the US troops deployed on the Korean Peninsula. I'm not saying a total withdrawal, but some element of redeployment. This is epitomised by the US's current focus on strategic flexibility. This is typical of the entrapment-abandonment dilemma present in alliance politics. On the one hand, South Korea remains very ambivalent about being entrapped in any China-Taiwan conflict. But the way to deal with this, in my view, is to strengthen alliances between the US, Japan, South Korea, and other Indo-Pacific states. More broadly, South Korea's response to the Ukraine war has arguably been not hugely impressive. It has engaged in the deployment of lethal aid via Poland, so indirectly, but it has kept saying under the Yoon Suk-yeol administration that if North Korea crossed the threshold, it would consider seriously supplying lethal assistance. Is deploying 14,000 troops not enough? And the reason I say this is to do with South Korea's response to Europe. What image does this portray of South Korea to its European partners? The final challenge I'd like to mention is domestic politics, as John mentioned earlier. And past progressive governments in South Korea, including that of Moon Jae-in, have adopted what has been known as an equidistant foreign policy between Washington and Beijing, or, as one South Korean analyst suggested, between South Korea and Japan. Lee Jae-myung's past statements have suggested an approach that seems to move away from the traditional idea of the US and South Korea being in lockstep. Whether that's Lee making clear that China's criticisms over THAAD, the Terminal High Altitude Aerial Defense System, are valid, whether that's Lee's claims of saying xie both to China and Taiwan, and asking, why does it matter to us in South Korea? In the prelude to the 2017 presidential election, following another impeachment, the ousting of Park Geun-hye, Lee infamously likened himself to Bernie Sanders. But I'll just take you back to December last year. In the first bill to impeach President Yoon, which did not pass, Lee and the DPK deemed one of the reasons for Yoon's impeachment to be that the Yoon administration had, and I quote, antagonized North Korea, China and Russia, insisted on bizarre Japan-centered foreign policies, and appointed figures lenient towards Tokyo to key government positions. Lee, in fact, ordered these parts about Yoon's diplomacy to be removed from the second bill, which did pass on the 14th of December. But the fact that a likely presidential candidate has made quite dismissive comments about what's called, US ROK Japan trilateralism and espouse quite anti-American, anti-Japanese sentiment is hardly unconcerning. These words are likely not to go unnoticed in Beijing, Pyongyang, and Moscow. There have been other controversies about Lee Jae-myung, a decision to send $8 million in remittances to North Korea through a South Korean conglomerate during his tenure as governor of Gyeonggi province, for which he's now been put on trial, now postponed. Only earlier this week, Lee Jae-myung said at a debate, a presidential debate, that he had nothing to do with it. But here is the but, because there's always a but when it comes to international relations. The likely election of Lee Jae-myung comes at a peculiar, and I use this word in what I would call the proper sense of the word, time, for South Korean foreign policy. If Lee Jae-myung does tilt towards Beijing, this will obviously go against Trump's goal of deterring Beijing. On the other hand, both Lee Jae-myung and Trump have expressed some kind of disdain for the stationing of US troops in South Korea. Lee Jae-myung notably termed them an occupying force, although an interview with Time magazine, released only yesterday, covers all of this up when he said that they actually play a very important critical role. Is he an ideologue, or does he have no ideology at all? Well, I can't really end a talk on North Korea without talking about whether Trump and Kim do meet again and sign another piece of paper pledging little. The risk here is that South Korea will now likely not be part of any discussion and won't want to ensure this eventuality. The Moon administration was a vital messenger between Kim and Trump during Trump 1.0. Trump and Kim now know each other. As John mentioned in his introductory remarks, this is Trump 2.0. But this is North Korea 3.0. We do need to take the North Korean nuclear threat seriously, amongst other threats from the DPRK, and we need to take broader regional threats seriously and not let domestic politics get in the way. Thank you.
Thank you, Edward. Useful reminder as well, I suppose, that how campaigning and governing are two very different activities, and it raises interesting questions about how much continuity there will be between Lee Jae-myung 1.0, and given that this is his second time running to be president, and the likelihood, given the polls, that he will be successful next week. Let's move on to Scott.
As was pointed out, you may have a slightly different description in your conference packet of this panel than was intended, but the original kind of framing for non-traditional security issues was how important are they relative to other security issues facing the Indo-Pacific. And my main point, if there's nothing else of substance that I say, is that non-traditional security issues for most of the Indo-Pacific countries are not at the top of the list, and that's probably as it should be. However, they will remain very firmly on the list, and those non-traditional security issues will at least periodically rise to the top of the list. For the simple reason rather, then that for several specific non-traditional security issues, the Indo-Pacific is differentially vulnerable and differentially at risk. And I would just like to briefly sketch the rationale for that with respect to three non-traditional security issues: climate, health, and emerging technology. I'm going to focus on climate, but I just want to briefly touch on the other two to kind of illustrate the broader and perhaps more substantive point. For health, we are only a few years now, obviously, out of a global pandemic, but the people who still think about pandemic risk seem to have a fairly high degree of consensus that within our lifetimes there will be at least one additional similar pandemic to COVID-19, perhaps several. And there are pretty good reasons to think that, as was the case with COVID-19, the Indo-Pacific region, especially East Asia, would be differentially affected by that pandemic risk for a combination of demographic geographic reasons. I think if we look forward a couple decades, a whole different set of non-traditional security issues related to emerging technology are also starting to come into focus, and that those threats range from potentially malicious uses of synthetic biology to malignant AI, to a whole other kind of swath of currently unimaginable sort of ramifications of various emerging technologies. To be sure, there will be opportunities that stem from those technologies as well, but those risks. And I think, again, particularly if we think about the East Asia region, it'll probably be differentially exposed to those risks because of the relative technological sophistication of those countries and those economies. In that sense, technological leadership may prove to be, in emerging technologies, may prove to be a little bit of a double-edged sword. Returning to climate, which is really my kind of main focus, and as a very brief bit of self-introduction, I head up something called the Climate Security and Geopolitics Project. And the premise of that project is that for better and worse, probably mostly worse, geopolitics is as important a determinant of our prospects for action on climate change as anything else, whether it's economics, energy, or indeed the environment, concern for the environment itself. And I just want to make a couple of observations departing from that premise as it pertains to how we can expect the climate issue to evolve in the context of Indo-Pacific security. First of all, it does bear, I think, reminding that while I think climate change is of concern to every country in the entire world, but especially the Indo-Pacific, it's really existential for a number of Indo-Pacific countries, most obviously the small island developing states, which, by the way, technically includes Singapore, usually forgotten, but despite its wealth and capability, is nonetheless existentially exposed to sea level rise. Worth also kind of keeping in mind in that vein that if we continue on our current emissions trajectory, within the lifetime of some of us in this room, several countries that are now countries will cease to exist as actual spatial territorial entities. And that will create existential questions and issues, not just for those countries and their populations, but also for our international system and order as we currently understand it. Second point, and this relates to part of the framing that John laid out of obviously thinking about the transition in the US administration. I do think that the US re-withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, the primary international agreement relating to climate change, creates an enormous soft power and diplomatic influence opportunity for China should it prove willing and able to take advantage of that opportunity. And I'm not sure that's it's clear that it can do so, which we can return to. But regardless, I think that climate policy and international climate negotiations have emerged as a really potentially important area for diplomatic and soft power contestation. I would actually, as a related kind of point, make the observation that if you think about kind of global governance more generally, I would say that China has had most success in gaining true peer status with other great powers in climate policy. It's probably been the arena in which China has been most diplomatically successful in that vein. And I think the US withdrawal will create even greater opportunity for China to enhance that influence and soft power such as it is. Incidentally, I do think, I mean, I'm not obviously a UK or EU expert, but I do think there's quite a bit of potential opportunity for European countries to fill some of this void as well. But we can talk more about that. Other point on sort of geopolitics and climate change related to the Indo-Pacific. The fact that there are obviously several large island and archipelagic economies in the Indo-Pacific means that this region, probably more so than most others, have in principle very strong national and energy security reasons to invest in renewable energy as an alternative to imported fossil fuels. Japan, Taiwan, even to a slightly lesser degree, the Philippines, Indonesia, have very strong energy security and resilience reasons to want to try to supplant fossil fuel imports that would obviously be easily disruptible or interdictable in a conflict scenario, and replace that with domestic renewable energy capacity. That hasn't really happened at scale yet, but as a sort of conceptual or theoretical possibility, I think it's something we'll see more discussion of going forward. The last thing, which relates a little bit more toward kind of an opportunity for cooperation perhaps, is that the very kind of vulnerability, I think, of the Indo-Pacific to a lot of climate impacts, and again, that has a lot to do with geography, both the prevalence of archipelagic states, small island states, but also the intense concentration of population and the built environment in coastal areas, again, particularly throughout East and Northeast Asia, also creates, I think, a real opportunity for countries of the region to cooperate on the adaptation side of climate change, which you hear a lot less about. Typically, when we talk about climate cooperation, the emphasis, and justifiably so, is more on cooperation to reduce emissions. But the vulnerability of the Indo-Pacific region, I think, creates some real impetus and opportunity to invest in cooperation on adapting to the climate change that is already taking place and will continue to take place and intensify into the future. And there are, again, some region-specific opportunities that I think exist. For example, Japan's global leadership in disaster relief, I think, creates some really good sort of foundational elements to build a regional adaptation cooperation agenda off of. The last thing I will mention, which departs from a meeting that I actually had over the lunch break here with a fascinating center here at Cambridge called the Center for Climate Repair, which looks at various geoengineering and climate interventions, is around uses of some exotic technological solutions to climate change that, again, as it so happens, are differentially prominent in the Indo-Pacific region. So Australia, for example, is a leader in this exotic space for applications like coral reef restoration. And thinking about those kind of comparative advantages as exotic but potentially quite impactful responses to climate change, I think can be quite fruitful and hopefully an area for more promising cooperation. I'll stop there.
Thank you. It's good to be able to think of optimistic, positive, mutually beneficial initiatives.
Doing my best.
Thank you very much. Haruko, are you going to continue in an optimistic strain?
Yes, actually okay. I am. Okay. I think so. First of all, thank you very much, John, and the Centre for Geopolitics for giving me this great opportunity to be back at Cambridge, and also to be able to actually address something that I wasn't really expecting to talk about, but non-traditional security is as good as any for me. And I want to, first of all, state where I'm coming from, because I obviously traveled from Osaka this time round, but the first couple of months earlier this year, I spent time talking to and sort of going to conferences that was organized by Yonsei University, National University of Singapore, in addition to a couple of other sort of think tank workshops involving Americans, Australians, and so on. And there's one thing that I realized, that as a Japanese, perhaps I probably should not promote Japan per se, but actually point out what I see it might be, if not obstructing, but clouding our vision in the way that we actually can cooperate more. So today I'm actually going to talk about two things. One is about non-traditional security, and also about a prescription for perhaps all of us to think about. First of all, I'm going back to the very first keynote. I'm talking about Indo-Pacific and the definition of geopolitics and so on. I thought non-traditional security itself the coinage of the word says something that we might be overlooking now. Traditional security, so why are we differentiating between traditional and non-traditional security? Partly because this is history. During the Cold War, there was only traditional security. But non-traditional security has a genealogy coming out from, well, pretty much in the 90s, but also very much also in the 80s when we started to see climate change issues, but as well as non-state actors, such as terrorism, international syndicate crime, basically meaning that when we talk about non-traditional security, it implies the non-Westphalian approach to tackling them. It is not a threat that can be tackled by one nation state alone. That inherently is an international or interstate or regional cooperation sort of project when we identify non-traditional security and say, let's work. So it would also imply something like the Mekong River management, to, as Scott just mentioned, about disaster risk management. Yes, Indo-Pacific has climate change problems, but we also have natural disaster problems in a way that perhaps is maybe more interesting for Europe to perhaps observe a bit more, because the kind of floods that have been hitting and upsetting Europe, the European continent, the past year or so, we get it every single year. Typhoon, Japan, Taiwan, Philippines, we get typhoons every single year. We get floods, landslides, not to mention volcanic eruptions and earthquakes. So in a way, that is, I think, the state of where our non-traditional interest in, if not a priority, as in terms of what's going on with literally with the geopolitics, where non-traditional security lay. It's really, you can't ignore it, and it's there. The other thing, though, what brings me to actually really be interested in talking about the non-traditional security is that it's, as I said, it's international collaboration. It needs multilateral institutions or coordination, which means it really points to what I think we haven't really been talking about today is with all of this Trump 2.0 or North Korea and Russia sort of closing in, and whether China, what sort of a weight is it going to sort of throw? And that's the UN system, which is being gutted. And if we're talking about, we just came out of the pandemic, and Americans are quick to blame. WHO was sabotaged by China and so on and so forth. But the point is, I think perhaps sometimes we really need to revisit and respect what the United Nations can do, how it might be able to sort of get back on its feet, perhaps not with the sort of moral authority that it had during the immediate post-Cold War era, but still as an institution with functions and a spirit that's worth preserving. So I won't go into the Security Council reform, but in any case, I think it's also very much good to remind ourselves that this is an institution, a global governance institution that I think we need to bear in mind, something that should be salvaged. My second point is really about, so how can we collaborate? How can we sort of think about reviving a spirit of international collaboration and cooperation? And given the morning of talks that I've heard today, I sort of came up with how do we go about addressing this? And I'm going to just point three things: the gaze, the narrative, and the lexicon. The gaze means, and if some of you, if you do, say, post-colonial studies or anthropology, I think the gaze is very important, where we are standing, what kind of bias we are using in order to look at the region. And the Indo-Pacific is one of the most ambiguous conceptually. It's actually a geopolitical concept, I would say, which people don't really agree with. I think the earlier rendition this morning about the arc of freedom and prosperity, and Japan's conception reaching all the way to just the Indian Ocean is actually a mistake. Our conception of Indo-Pacific reaches to Africa. Because the whole idea of the prosperity, the arc of freedom and prosperity was really to kind of line up all the countries that we have given official development assistance. That includes Africa. And thinking maybe at the end of this arc and our sort of way of looking, organizing our efforts perhaps in the past 50 years, we might be able to sort of switch to another way of thinking about our international policy. That said, so this is Japan looking at the Indo-Pacific and how the Indo-Pacific looks from the United States, how it's conceived, how it looks from Europe, European Union, or NATO. I think they're inherently different. And to me, my little sort of worry today I had was that we are actually quite beholden to how this post-1945 world was conceived. This is very US-centric, hub and spokes, however you want to say it, it's Atlantic community gaze. And so I sort of wrote on a very different proposal once that America looks at Asia from across the Atlantic. America's been engaging with the United States, I'm sorry, and it's been successful, but at the same time, it's also left a lot of gaping sort of issues. San Francisco system is in some ways, it's a history part not finished. So I think one of the other things, so this is where I talk about the gaze, and then we move to the idea of narrative, to be conscious where we're looking from. How, even if Ukraine, the European and East Asian security are indivisible, I do think that how we actually talk about European security concerns, Ukraine being sort of somewhat, arguing that Taiwan is the next Ukraine, that is a very Western-centric way of looking at our side of the problem. But this is where we move to narrative. Narrative is very important because, as I said, we are sort of subconsciously, and we have been trained habitually to think in terms of how America's global strategy matters a lot. And I'm not saying that they have the controlling voice, but do we, in the Indo-Pacific, or even in East and Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia, have a list of things of how we want Americans to engage in Asia? And I think this is something that's an exercise that's not been done, which means we're also forfeiting ownership of our own fate, of how we want to be even engaging with China. I think some of you have heard me sort of complain, the last thing we want is the US-China rivalry to be dictating how things turn out in Northeast and Southeast Asia. So that's my sort of conscious, I think we need to sort of be conscious about how we look at the narrative and think about, okay, can we come up with a different one? And this, I think, in this situation, we need, I think, the Europeans and the Asians, East Asians, and also, well, actually, the Indo-Pacific community to look around and see what is a narrative that, whether it's Eurasian continent or not, what is the narrative that might take us towards the next 30, 40 years and perhaps prevent the geopolitics from disrupting and erupting. And so finally, this is where I think the exercise is about lexicon. We need to share the same ideas and concepts, even though we might be speaking the same language. I'll tell you one thing that was really interesting when we did a workshop in Japan with the United States about 10 years ago, about peace building. And we were talking, Japan was talking about human security, conflict resolution, HADR, all of those things. America just came up as a counterinsurgency. And it didn't surprise us But even if we're talking military to military, and these are the conceptual differences and the map that we don't share, then I think that's a problem. So I think these are the, and finally, I think not just the lexicon, but I think also we need to share the map. A map of what's the security issue, what are the political issues, and not so much rely on how we project, how, for example, Asia sees the European security situation. If we had a chance to discuss it with Europeans would say, you know nothing about Europe. And so I think this is a very good opportunity, since the United States has in some ways shot itself in the foot and forfeited. And if we're panicking about, well, the United States is withdrawing from international institutional commitments, and perhaps it's a time for us to earnestly start thinking from this other side of this Eurasian continent to really see what practical things we can do together, and not so much think about, oh, how do we do US-China rivalry or not? Because as I said, and as everybody I think recognizes, there are plenty of non-traditional security issues. And particularly for, say, Japan and Korea, we actually do have a lot of similar non-traditional security concerns that we actually project and work on in Asia, in Southeast Asia. And I am really hoping that if we can actually work together on some of these issues, it might have a spillover effect for Japan and Korea to collaborate more and, in a way, become better, well, partners, if not friends. So I think, in that sense, this area of non-traditional security or human security issues really do have a lot of potential in not only solving real problems, but also changing regional or country-to-country relationships. So that is my humble input. Thank you.
Thank you, Haruko, and thank you for emphasizing the importance of trying to create shared perspectives. Your reference to maps reminds me of an anecdote. The former Deputy National Security Advisor of Japan, Kanehara Nobukatsu, who provided a lot of the impetus that shaped Abe's foreign policy, had a map in his office in the Prime Minister's residence, which shows China's orientation towards the Pacific, viewing the first and second and third island chains from the vantage point of Beijing. And I think it's striking just how much effort has been put to try and, on the part of Japan and other countries, to put themselves in the shoes of adversaries, but also of like-minded countries. I'm sure we'll want to come back to this idea of how best to create a common perspective and to try and identify how large the gaps are between European and Asian partners and thinking about all of these competing issues. Last but not least, Kevin.
Okay, thank you very much, John, and thank you everybody for making it to the last panel and to the last speaker of the last panel. That's very much appreciated. I will spend a bit of time picking up this issue of non-traditional security issues, but also sort of building also on what Edward was talking about in relation to the Korean Peninsula and to North Korea. Now, if anybody has any familiarity with how debate about North Korea has unfolded over the last 3 decades, you'll be aware of the fact that it's been divided into this containment versus engagement camps, which are pretty well defined within the sort of policy and academic circles. Sometimes this debate is fractious, although there's a shared perspective that something in North Korea needs to change, whether it's a maximalist goal of complete denuclearization or regime change, or inducing North Korea along a path of reform and transition towards potentially other sort of reformed socialisms within Asia, something like more along China or Vietnamese lines. But I think in 2025 it would be difficult to say that either of these camps have been particularly vindicated by what's happened when we think about all the dynamics that you were talking about, although of course both camps would say that their policies have not had the time to bear fruit because they've been interfered by discontinuities by the other side of that debate as well. But I think in that context, what I would like to do is just try then to go a bit beyond the kind of maximalist traditional security goals, but thinking about non-traditional security issues and the relationship with more traditional security issues, and then potentially thinking of various sort of ways forward, because as we know, non-traditional security issues can have an impact on human security, human insecurity, I should say, and then poor human security can also impact back on the state's security policies, as we see in North Korea, which can have negative impacts on people within and outside the country. So in the North Korean context, of course, North Korea is within a geopolitical environment, which from the North Korean perspective they use the term hostile environment, but what that means in reality is that you have the situation of a divided peninsula, an inter-Korean competition for legitimacy, which North Korea is pretty much losing and has definitely lost that. But also this standoff with the United States and security. And that leads to poor outcomes, or exacerbates existing poor outcomes in terms of human insecurity, because resources get diverted from human needs towards the military. Military spending goes up. There's an emphasis on sovereignty over security, which you see in the area of food, for example, and conversely, challenges from unmet human needs, whether it's climate-related disasters, whether it's food insecurity, whether it's poor public health. This can lead to a kind of a legitimacy challenge to the state, and a kind of an effort at rallying around the flag, which diverts attention from these unmet human needs, and that leads to threats to neighbors, provocations, and all these kind of things. So there's a kind of vicious cycle between traditional and non-traditional security challenges. But there is a history of dealing with non-traditional security issues in North Korea, of course. Just to choose one example of public health. So for 3 decades, international organizations, humanitarian NGOs have been working in North Korea, which as we've seen in the COVID pandemic, this is important not just for the domestic population, but these are cross-border issues, right? So even though North Korea has this rhetoric of self-reliance within every sphere, actually, but also within the area of public health, you have the WHO, you have the United Nations Population Fund, you have the World Food Programme, UNICEF, plus these humanitarian NGOs which operate within North Korea. And one of the effects that you see in North Korean health policy, it does align with international norms. You can see it in the emphasis on disease control, on maternal and child health, health systems, and things like the WHO framework on tobacco use and things like that. And it doesn't achieve those bigger security goals, but we see that it has some impact. So the surveys that are done within North Korea do show a consistent trend of improving outcomes in public health particularly since the 2010s. So if we look at child mortality rates or nutrition rates amongst children, there is a general trend of improvement, which is partly about these interventions, vaccination programs, things like that. But it's also, it could be just also an outcome of a generally improving economy, at least until the end of the 2010s. Nonetheless, there are 2 significant challenges towards tackling these kind of non-traditional security issues in North Korea at the moment. The first one is pretty much everything that Edward talked about, right? Which is that there's probably no time in the last 3 decades where North Korea has been less willing to work with the outside world to tackle these kinds of issues. So since 2020, you had COVID, you had the border lockdown, a complete collapse in cross-border trade, an exodus of diplomats and other like aid workers working in North Korea, and they've still not gone back. Trade has not recovered to the point that it was pre-pandemic, and certainly not pre-2017. So, and we see the North Korean state is trying to, at least in a partial sense, it's trying to reverse processes of marketization and re-establish firm state control, right? As I say, some diplomatic staff have returned, but so far the international organizations and NGOs have not. And then there's a hardening rhetoric. Again, Edward mentioned the Kim Jong-un's two-state theory, which is directed to South Korea, but it does also point to this, the North Korean state's kind of resistance to allowing the so-called international community back into North Korea. And we see an increased fear of foreign influence as well. So in 2020, the North Korean state passed this law on the rejection of reactionary thought and culture, which explicitly punishes any kind of it's particularly related to South Korean culture, but any visible signs of South Korean cultural influence is illegal and can be harshly punished. So tackling these sort of non-traditional security issues now in North Korea is much more challenging. I mean, you could also say there may be an opening, who knows, with Trump and with Lee Jae-myung, but for the reasons we've heard, I mean, this is not self-evident that this is going to be the case. And within South Korea, there's a fear that any renewed diplomacy between the US and North Korea may leave South Korea behind and more exposed if any deal with Trump tackles, for example, long-range nuclear weapons capabilities, but doesn't tackle the short-range kind of artillery or missiles capable of targeting North Korea. Now, so that's, there's no hiding that. That's a real challenge. And it's going to be up to diplomats to adopt a kind of optimism of the will, if you like, and see whether there's any room for opening. It's also about North Korea's relationships with Russia and to what extent that turns out to be long-term, or whether North Korea still has as its end goal a kind of normalization and recognition as a nuclear state, which would be the precursor for more normal relations with other states. So that's one challenge. The second challenge is probably a bit more theoretically achievable by sort of outside powers, but it's related to the nature of the sanctions regime and how the comprehensive sanctions regime impedes the tackling of non-traditional security issues within North Korea, such as public health. So international organizations that operate in North Korea, the NGOs, they're very vocal about this, about the added time and cost and complexity that adhering to international sanctions adds to any kind of sort of humanitarian public health or all these other kinds of non-traditional security issue engagement within North Korea. So it's things like dual use restrictions if you're importing syringes which have metal in them, for example, that adds a whole range of bureaucratic processes and form filling and legal advice that these organizations need to go through. Something else which they've been very vocal about is the lack of a banking channel. So even for representatives of UN organizations in North Korea, there's no mechanism where you can just send money to North Korea to fund their operations. This has to be carried in with cash, for example, right? So there's somebody somewhere across the Sino-North Korean border with huge bags of cash, right? Going into North Korea to try to get these kind of operations going. And then there's the oil embargo as well, and the agricultural sector, the public health sector. I mean, they're all energy dependent, right? Particularly agriculture, because North Korea has a very sort of energy intensive agricultural sector. And North Korea's food crisis is essentially an energy crisis, whereby it's not able to import. Notwithstanding, of course, a lot of this oil and energy is deployed for military purposes. So those are potentially areas where the sanctions regime could be reformed in order to facilitate this kind of humanitarian work and treatment of non-traditional security issues. But yeah, just to say, these are approaches which doesn't sort of depend on pursuing maximalist goals and doesn't, I don't think, detract from that, and maybe have positive outcomes in terms of pursuing improved human security in North Korea, but also could potentially break some of this vicious cycle between the traditional and non-traditional security issues. But I think I'll finish there.
Kevin, thank you. That's very, very helpful in sort of threading this delicate path between these more extreme positions in a way. Before I open it up to the floor, let me sort of raise for all the panelists a few brief ideas just to reflect on and to ask you to give your immediate response briefly, if you can. As we've heard from Kevin already, right, there are sort of opportunities with North Korea for some sort of re-engagement that doesn't operate within the framework of the traditional engagement strategy. Are there areas in particular where the vulnerabilities that not just North Korea but other states that are seen as adversaries in the traditional security area face that provide a common basis for cooperation? The environment perhaps is one area. It's often cited in the case of North Korea as a particularly pressing concern, and there have been periodic efforts by governments in South Korea to try and address that question. And also to try and assess, to come back to a theme that we talked about earlier, the desire for engagement at a political level is sometimes also a reflection of opportunities for individual leaders to demonstrate relevance. And there's almost a competitive process triggered in part by Trump's initiatives with the Kim regime. For other countries, we now know that Prime Minister Ishiba wants and has said on record that he wants to meet with the North Korean counterpart. How relevant is that for other countries in the region? That's my first question. The second question is to sort of pick up some of the themes that were pointed out. Scott, you talked about the sort of capacity of Pacific Island states to address in these innovative ways the climate change implications for themselves. So I wanted to think more broadly about risk mitigation and to try and identify which states have a particular comparative advantage in certain areas. Haruko, I think you mentioned disaster relief in the case of Japan. That's very relevant when we think about earthquakes. South Korea, of course, in addressing the COVID-19 pandemic, seemed particularly capable in marrying technology and drawing on public confidence, which is a bit paradoxical when you consider how polarized the country is, how much distrust there is towards politicians. When it came to the response to COVID-19, there was a really quite significant level of public engagement with the government's initiatives. And it's interesting to try and speculate why in those areas do you see a sense of solidarity and common purpose that sometimes transcends these sometimes much more divisive political tensions. And the third issue, which was prompted really by Haruko's very interesting ideas about perception, comes back to another issue which I think is increasingly relevant, which I mentioned in the second panel this morning, which is education. And if we think again back to the Cold War, this was not only a battle between rival alliances, it was not only about territory and geopolitics, it was also a battle for hearts and minds. And it seems to me that this is an area where there are both opportunities and challenges. The opportunities are, of course, the beleaguered nature of American universities. We can all think of examples in the sciences and the humanities happening right now of US academics approaching foreign universities because they're facing budget cuts that mean that they simply cannot conduct their basic research. And if one thinks about the European Union, for example, the Horizon Research Programme makes it mandatory that you have at least, I think, 5 countries involved in every bid. This is a model, if you like, that might be extended in an Asian context where one could think about cooperative initiatives. And if you think about the success that the United States enjoyed through initiatives such as the Fulbright program, now, of course, are very much at risk, the Ford Foundation, private initiatives plus government initiatives, these involve not only securing expertise, but creating if you like, a common epistemic community. And you might argue that the United States was remarkably successful in doing that, because we can think of many of the governments in Europe in which now prominent politicians had formative experiences studying in the United States. So to what extent are there opportunities for creating new common epistemic communities involving Asian and European partners? I think of graduate school enterprises in Northeast Asia that bring together Chinese, Japanese, and Korean students. Is there something similar that could be done to link European and Asian countries? Our ambassador, Julia Longbottom, in Japan, just announced the so-called Musubi initiative to create new ties, to bring together British and Japanese partners in a wide area of different educational initiatives. Leading me to my fourth and final question. During the Cold War, it was common amongst force planners to ask this famous question: how much is enough? How much security do you need in order to guarantee resilience? It's, I think, equally important to ask how much is enough and how long is enough when we think about the challenges we've been talking about. Now, what sort of time horizon should we be planning for? For just the Trump administration, surviving until the midterms, looking beyond 2028, or longer? If we think back to the formative beginning years of the Cold War, the establishment of a national security state in the Truman administration was premised on the assumption that the conflict with the Soviet Union was going to be a long conflict and required a whole panoply of institutions both within the United States and internationally. It seems to me that we haven't really explored this question of time horizons, and so I'd be interested to know your immediate response to that question as well. So, Edward, perhaps you can start.
Thank you, John. I'll take a couple of the questions and just give some quite brief answers. In terms of engagement with North Korea on issues such as the environment, this form of engagement has happened in the past, not just between North Korea and the South, other actors involving Europe and the EU as well. But the issue for this form of engagement is when engaging on an issue such as the environment, on which the North Koreans in the past have been willing to talk, turn into what the North Koreans deem to be a political issue. So if there is engagement on the environment, but the North Koreans deem that this is a stepping stone towards talks on, say, denuclearization or economic reform or political reform, then the North Koreans will actually not want to take part in any such engagement. And that's a very difficult line to draw. How does one pitch these forms of engagement? In terms of the desire for engagement at a political level, it's not just Ishiba who has made clear his desire to engage in talks with Kim Jong-un. Kishida tried to do that as well and got a very, very firm rebuttal from Kim Yo-jong, Kim Jong-un's sister, when she basically said, well, I mean, there's no form of engagement possible unless Japan halts its engagement with the hostile United States. So engagement requires two to tango. And I think the case of the Inter-Korean hotline is an interesting one, because you can want the hotline to reopen and for there to be communications, but if no one picks up on the other end, or if the other end cuts the communications, then it's actually very, very difficult. And that's sadly the point at which we're in at the moment. On the point of how much is enough, it reminds me of Kenneth Waltz's idea to do with nuclear weapons. You know, more may be better. You know, when we talk about states with nuclear weapons, how many nuclear weapons are enough? Why don't we countries just get one or two? Why do they need? Why does China and North Korea need to proliferate vertically more and more? In terms of time frame, I think longer term, yes, I'm reluctant to put a precise number on it. I think that on the part of South Korea, the question to which I don't know the answer, I think that we're all looking for is, will an Lee Jae-myung government make a foreign policy change now, or will it wait until the midterms in the US? Will Lee Jae-myung just play the non-ideological line for the next year and a half and see what happens? That could be a plausible strategy. It also might not happen. I think there is a need, though, to plan for the long term, particularly because of what's known as the CRINC, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. This, whatever you want to call it, axis of autocracies, alliance of aggressors, you can call it varieties of variations on a theme. And that this broader coalition, what Zbigniew Brzezinski might have termed an anti-hegemonic coalition, going against the US-led international order, this distinction between democracies and autocracies getting starker, I think means that we do have to plan beyond the mere end of Trump's second term.
Okay, Scott.
Just in response to your prompt, I mean, there are a couple of actually quite, I think, interesting kind of national areas of specialty and excellence that I think could contribute actually to solutions to some of the non-traditional security challenges that we've talked about. And just in addition to those that have come up so far, Singapore, leader in water security, Taiwan, health, as well as, interestingly, fisheries. Taiwan has the world's 4th largest fishing fleet. It's a distant 4th, but nonetheless very significant. And speaking of kind of oceans, I think there's tremendous opportunity to develop like an ocean conservation agenda, both regionally and globally, that would build on many countries in particularly the Pacific region. And last but not least, actually, China. Obviously China's a leader in a lot of clean energy technology, some cases infamously so, but also some important adaptation strategies as well. There's something called sponge cities, which is a kind of nationwide effort to increase the permeability of China's cities, which is an important component of resilience in a sort of climate-constrained world. One final thing I just thought may be relevant to mention on this question of sort of how should we relate or equate traditional and non-traditional security issues. I was at a conference here in the UK just after the US election and before the most recent climate conference, and a phrase was kind of coined there that I've come back to so often, that now it's about guns versus butter versus climate. And most countries can only afford to do at best 2 of the 3. So which 2 is it going to be? And obviously the implication is that, for climate, what does get done on climate is probably going to be kind of instrumentally more in relation to guns and butter.
Okay, thank you. Haruko.
You ask so many complex questions.
But
but
you don't
I'll
have to
just,
answer them all.
no,
pick
but
one if you
I'll
want.
just talk a bit about North Korea. I was in a conference a couple of years ago when I was asked to talk about Japan's policy towards North Korea. And it was led by a friend who was actually doing something to do with sort of normalizing and socializing North Korea in the region, which had to be led by Southeast Asian countries that have diplomatic ties, and including 2 other countries in Europe, Switzerland and Sweden. And I was of the view that this is where I think, for North Korea's sake too, that we need these countries to take the lead, to sort of really, because North Korea will have conversation with these countries, whether it's Vietnam, Singapore, Malaysia, so on. And for Japan and South Korea to take the back seat and see how it goes, because But this is, of course, a couple of years ago, before or sort of just the beginning of Ukraine and Russia's sort of rekindling or their ties with North Korea. But I do think that some of the assumptions that we have about how to engage, to address North Korea's stance, it might be a good idea without, maybe resurrect the six-party talks without us. Six-party talk, but because Japan's been a spoiler, but I think if it weren't for Donald Trump, it might have been a good idea for the United States to right now reach out to China and say, let's talk about North Korea. Because I think China's not necessarily in that four-axis. So, but that's my view. And on the point of just on that, what skill sets does Japan have in terms of some of the environmental issues? And I definitely think it's earthquake resilient architecture. I was told once by a Chinese that they were really surprised that during an earthquake, the Japanese would sort of run into public schools, public buildings basically. And she said that, well, in China, during the Xinjiang earthquake, the schools were the ones to collapse first. And so this is just a matter of also, public policy priorities. But when it comes to earthquake resilience, because this is a life and death matter for us. And so I think this kind of technology perhaps can be shared, be more sort of used for everybody, but yes.
Thank you. Kevin.
Okay, I'll just pick up on your question about areas of engagement. As I said, there's already a long history of engagement over these issues, whether it's over climate or forestry, for example, and as I spoke about public health, even areas like human rights, which seems odd. But of course, North Korea doesn't engage in any process where it feels it's being singled out for political and human rights. And North Korea is still, as I'm sure nobody would disagree, very dire in terms of its human rights. But it does engage with certain things like the rights of the disabled and things like that, things that are presented, particularly through UN forums in a more general sense. It's highly unfortunate that North Korea will not engage with South Korea because South Korea has the most sort of expertise on this anywhere in the world in terms of these challenges with research institutes and journals and these kind of things that deal with things like North Korean forests, North Korean sort of public health and land and population and all these kind of things. But as I said, for particular reasons, I think it was the failure of the Hanoi summit in 2019 and the fact that the North Koreans were quite sort of humiliated by that whole process and sort of held the Moon Jae-in government as partly responsible for failing to act as a bridge between Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump. But also, as I said, the general fear of South Korean influence, which I think has become even more and more heightened over time. China, we don't really know a great deal about what China is doing in North Korea. China, the amount of information coming out of China these days about what it's doing in North Korea seems to be getting less and less as it's regarded as something of a national security issue. We also don't know much about Russia, although there have been recent reports that there are some mentions of collaboration with Russia over sort of North Korea's pharmaceutical industry, for example, and it does seem, there's a group of researchers at Harvard University who look into these public health issues in a lot more detail, practitioners and academics, who have looked at the import data for North Korea and have shown that North Korea, after COVID, really ramped up its import of medical and pharmaceutical products, and the aim seems to be targeting a kind of the development of a homegrown kind of pharmaceutical industry, which would actually, I guess, in its own view, reduce the dependence on external help. So there's various stuff going on there with surrounding countries, it seems. I guess one of the big questions is if and when the international organizations are going to be allowed back in, the UN organizations, for example. And that's still a big unknown. That would kind of be necessary because you need to have a needs and priorities assessment to be done at some point to allow some of these other humanitarian organizations in. But many of these organizations, they still have staff within North Korea, but so it looks like it's not a complete end to that, but it's about when these external connections can start up again. But I'll stop there because I'm sure people in the audience have questions.
Okay, great, thank you. Yes, let's open up to questions. Right at the back, Winnie, I think, you.
This question or comment is inspired by Professor Sato and what you said in terms of the inclusion of Asia and Asia's perspectives of, maybe what security may be, or even maybe perceptions of what the Indo-Pacific may represent. Okay, please don't be mad. Security is inherently something that's positioned and perceived from the nation state, yeah? And a lot of what we discussed on the panel is very much about cooperation in areas where it's an international effort in order to resolve issues of climate change, and no one can dispute that. But when it comes to nation states that are inherently underdeveloped, do not have the technology, of course are at risk when it comes to climate change, but do not have the financial capability to buy the newest technology, et cetera, their priorities, their hierarchy of priorities are inherently different than what we may see in the West. Yeah? So whether we're talking about how nation states will resolve or identify risks of traditional security or non-traditional security, more of the global South will see, well, I'm not talking about climate change, I'm talking about food. I'm talking about water. I'm talking about whether or not the harvest will be able to feed my population, or my population will be able to survive the next pandemic, right? I think when we talk about the idea of the role of the international system, multilateral organizations, I think we need to remember that they can't be separated from that of the nation state. They work in tandem. And it isn't that a nation state chooses, oh, well, we're just going to cooperate and we're going to do this in the multilateral system, but actually they also have the capability and the agency to work individually, bilaterally, multilaterally, or minilaterally, and it comes from their own particular cultural, historical, political perspective. They all work as one, right? So whether we're talking about North Korea and whether or not North Korea will be willing to engage with more openly with South Korea because South Korea is making certain overtures, there are certain political contexts which we may not from the West see as legitimate, but from North Korea's perspective, they would, right? Because their calculation of what is risk is fundamentally different than what we may perceive. And in order for us to understand why nation states make the decisions that they do, they will engage or not engage, and this is where I'm saying don't be mad, is that I think Trump 1.0 actually provided I think it started before Trump 1.0, but I think his government provided a vision where what would traditionally be seen as weaker nation states could act independently to fulfill their own security and national objectives, which is why we're starting to see, particularly today, a lot of activity in the global South where they're trying to move away from long-standing colonial ties, such as in West Africa, West and Central Africa. And I know we're talking about Indo-Pacific, but it's not just that part, right? We see it in the Middle East, we see it happening in Asia itself, where there's starting to be activities where nation states want to identify and fulfill and secure their positions, whether through the traditional lines aren't necessarily going to be able to cut it because they don't have the budget for it, and major powers in the region of the Indo-Pacific aren't going to allow that to happen, but non-traditional means and mechanisms will allow them to do that. And there's far more flexibility within that allows them to either diversify their supply chains, to secure their resources, and break old traditional supply chains that undermine their ability to develop. I just wanted to say that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think there was a question in front in here. Is that right? Yep.
Sure. So, Dr. Sato, so I have a question about conducting actually research from Westerners conducting research on Asia. You said there's been a very Atlantic or Western type gaze toward Asia. And so when Westerners are doing research on Asia, how does one perhaps overcome accusations of an implicit bias, okay? Perhaps anecdotal, I'll give you an example, okay? So when I had a Taiwan fellowship, I was doing research on how China viewed the pivot, or do you remember the US was supposed to be pivoting around 2000, so-and-so, to the Asia Pacific. And so I did a lot of field research, in China on that. And when it published it, and it was fine as a publication, but when I presented it at conferences, then people took exception to it, essentially saying, no, is this really what China thinks? Have you presented this correctly? And so I know this is a much more research-oriented type question, but I just, when you were talking about having, this research is very Atlantic-centered, needing to have a different gaze. But how do you look at it with a different gaze without being questioned as a scholar?
Okay, let's move over to the other side, right in the front. Let's take these two questions.
So I think this is for Scott. It's interesting to hear about the pandemic. I think HIV/AIDS came to prominence in the 80s, and that was like a slow burn pandemic. Then 20 years later, we had SARS, 2003, but that was very localized. And then Ebola, about almost 10 years after that, again, localized. So we were kind of unprepared, and then we had the COVID pandemic. And have we learned our lesson? Are we better prepared going forwards? So that was one question. Second, a quick one. China already took the lead in solar panels, whereas in the US, I think the fossil fuel industry and the lobbying is so strong that it's kind of like a deterrence. It's not as profitable as solar panels. So perhaps you'd like to expound on that. And if I can get one more in. Kevin, there was a commander in the European theatre in World War II. And when he went to Korea, he said it's only when he got to Korea that he understood what true devastation is. Does that colour the Koreans' memory and hence the positions they take? And do we give that enough weighting? Thank you.
Okay, pass the microphone to your left. Yeah.
Thank you. Just a kind of comment/question. So I think in terms of the distinction between traditional security and non-traditional security, I kind of speculate the situation in maritime cooperation in Indo-Pacific, in which Japan has assisting the Coast Guard development, capacity development in Southeast Asian country, which initially, because this pilots or terrorism, especially getting the attention in after 9/11 in the US, so a lot of and then Japan uses civilian capacity to support because it's a civilian. But now, obviously, China has this maritime militia, which they say the civilian, but obviously you see kind of paid A behind that one. And then now Coast Guard, in South Asian Coast Guard, using the Coast Guard capacity to counter against Chinese maritime militia, civilian, Coast Guard, whatever. And I just quite wonder what this is. So Japan was doing this as a civilian assistance, but obviously we see this kind of more traditional characteristic in non-traditional security. And I just wonder, how do we actually have to distinguish between traditional security and non-traditional security is actually valid in the current situations, especially maritime cooperation, how do we kind of conceptualize how you kind of understand this context? I just want to have any insight from the panelists. Thank you.
Okay, and there was a question at the back of the room on the left-hand side. Let's have that as the last question. Was there someone who had their hand up? No? Anybody else before I turn to the panel? In that case, we've got 5 minutes, so a minute each, maximum.
I'll take the question on the Korean War. Yes, the Korean War has obviously left an indelible mark on South and North Korea, right? The simple fact that the war, technically speaking, never ended, given the fact that there was a ceasefire and armistice agreement and not a peace treaty, is very much embedded in North Korea's worldview, but it's also ever more embedded in South Korea's worldview. Recent debates about Ukraine. When I was last in South Korea recently, debates were pertaining to whether South Korea would actually send troops, right, to or even lethal aid and lethal assistance to Ukraine directly. Well, the pushback to that would be, well, actually, South Korea's actually had experience of being devastated by the Korean War. Therefore, Seoul is best placed to engage in post-war reconstruction. That's one. On the other side, obviously, the North Korean narrative of the Korean War, which is fundamentally untrue, in terms of how the war began, but also the armistice agreement, very much a legacy, has influenced North Korea's foreign policy and worldview. North Korea still invokes the armistice agreement to this day, particularly the fact that South Korea never signed it. There's a lot more to say, but I'll that's my minute up. I'll pass it to Scott.
On the COVID, preparedness question, I think, somewhat better prepared, but almost certainly not well prepared enough. And I'm pretty confident that by the time the next pandemic hits, most of the lessons, learned will have been forgotten. But there are some hopeful signs. Just a couple weeks ago, the WHO brokered a pandemic treaty, which improves, at least on paper, we don't know how to play it in practice yet, a lot of data sharing provisions regarding epidemiological data. Obviously doesn't include the US, which is, a big absence, but I think there are some hopeful signs there. On sort of, oil and gas versus, solar, really, so I was hanging around in Beijing back in 2008-9 on a Fulbright grant, and I was sort of present at that when at the time there were legions of foreigners in Beijing trying to tell anyone who would listen, and to the extent I was actively doing what I was supposed to be doing on my Fulbright grant, one of them saying, listen, investing in clean energy is a way that China can leapfrog incumbent industries like the internal combustion engine, where it's not competitive, and can sort of develop its own economy, gain economic value, and contribute to climate protection all at the same time. I think everyone was surprised by how much that argument actually resonated and was converted into policy, to the point where I think it's pretty much been too successful in terms of the leapfrogging. That being said, I think it's important to keep in mind most of these technologies, EVs are a little bit of an exception, but solar panels are very low value added actually. And I think from a sheer economic perspective, there's sort of a supply chain dependency argument I think you could make, but from a sheer kind of economic value added argument, you don't really care that much if you're not a dominant solar panel producer, because it's really just not a hugely high value added industry, and the margins are nothing like in oil and gas, which leads me to my last point, which is the U.S. Policy right now is essentially an all of the above energy strategy, where we're going to continue to expand renewables, but we're just not going to provide policy support for them. They have to compete on their own merits, and meanwhile, oil and gas is going to continue to be part of our energy mix for some time to come. And I think there are some pragmatic reasons for that. Incidentally, that policy looks a lot like China's climate and energy policy. So I think we'll kind of continue to see that. Last thing, which is just a reaction to the point about kind of patterns of national and international cooperation. I think constructivism, so for a long time, climate policy was a really good constructivist kind of case study. I think what's kind of been interesting is just that as an empirical matter, constructivism has a lot less explanatory power over the last decade of kind of international climate negotiations than it did in the first 20. You can debate why, but I think that's a pretty solid observation to make.
Thank you. Hariko.
I'll just answer the question that was, I didn't really mean that the Western gaze is the wrong, but I think it was just a matter of we all need to realize that we have a gaze and we need to know that whatever's talked about here or in another place, say in Southeast Asia, because that was, is that it's not necessary, you can't take for granted that everybody has a similar map or a similar gaze. And sometimes these differences become stark, not necessarily between, say, me coming to Europe, but sometimes even when I'm in Southeast Asia and we're talking about the Quad, the Southeast Asian view of the Quad is shockingly Southeast Asian gaze. So it wasn't really about how do we go about correcting it or not. It's just that I think we just need to recognize that gazes are different and we need to be a little more conscious of the fact that we all have inherent biases, lenses. That was what I meant to say. So does that answer? Yes, it does. Thank you.
Okay, so actually I think there were 2 points actually that are sort of related, and one was this observation that the calculation of risk may be different to what we would expect, but also there's points to the fact that ideas play a really important role in determining how states act, right? You don't have to be a social constructivist to appreciate the formative role of ideas in that respect. And this is not to justify anything, but it's the fact that, as Edward was saying, the Korean War deeply shaped, obviously, both Koreas. In fact, I find it useful often not to think of the two Koreas as polar opposites in ideological terms, but as both shaped by a kind of post-colonial nationalism that was also, so the colonial period is very important, but they didn't necessarily experience the Korean War in the same way. I mean, it was traumatic for both of them, but as you were saying, the bombing of North Korea during a particular stage of the Korean War led to the deaths of up to a fifth of the population, which if you see why they were from a very early stage, sort of hell-bent on developing a nuclear weapons program, you can perhaps trace it back to that experience during the Korean War and having nuclear weapons as the ultimate guarantor of security, which in a way they are, right? In that respect. But it's not just the Korean War. I mean, the colonial experience itself, as I mentioned, but also North Korea's specific experience during the Sino-Soviet split and other sort of events have all collectively shaped that. So yeah, absolutely. And in some ways, a lot of people talk about sort of North Korea's Juche ideology as playing a role, of ideology of sort of self-reliance as well, which is, again, it's not unusual for a post-colonial state to have this kind of view of wanting to get away from the colonial past through a policy of self-reliance. But I think all these experiences have sort of over-determined the North Korean case to the extent that this has become such a fundamental principle, therefore leading to this different sort of calculation of risk where, for example, sovereignty is in food, for example, is considered to be more important than security of food. I mean, ideally one would lead to the other, but sovereignty is the overriding principle. But yeah. But that's a long way of saying yes. Yes, I agree. Yeah.
Okay. On that note of consensus, thank you very much. We've had a diversity of views, lots of different perspectives and ideas. It's been, I think, again, a really stimulating discussion. Thank you very much to the panelists.